Hi, and welcome to the Scientistsage Sangha. Tonight, you're here with Nancy Anderson Dolan from Wise Heart Wellness, and we're going to talk about Yahoo. Before we weird anybody out about that, it's an acronym we're working with, and it's a nod to a exhibition and fair that takes place in my city. And it's getting underway this Friday, and it's a Western city, Calgary, and it's called the Greatest Outdoor Show on Earth. And so it's a big celebration in my city, and the theme really is Yahoo. We have big street signs that say Yahoo. That's the whole thing. The advertising is all about that. And in my years as an addict and my work with the addicts, I found that stampede time can cause some issues and cause people to think that they don't have any other options except to overindulge and do things that perhaps are not so healthy for them. And so this came about when a group of people, actually a 12-step convention of a couple hundred people came to town, and people actually made little things like this for everyone in the convention. And on the back of it, I don't know if you'll be able to read that because of the lighting, but it says you always have other options. And so this idea of having other options has been around for a long time in addiction circles. And I would say it's probably one of the main things that counselors and therapists and good friends try to encourage for people that are struggling, that there are other options than the path they keep going down or the paths they're considering going down. And it's really just like any alternatives. There are some places where there isn't, or we react too fast to consider the alternatives. But almost everything, we can have other options. And a lot of the work that I do is helping people generate other options. And so we're going to be talking a lot about that. But our brains really push us into this little narrow thing like this, where we don't think there's any options out here. And it causes us to believe things that aren't going to work, or there aren't any. And we get stuck, fixated in our heads that this is the only option there is, or there's none at all, and I have to go forward with my way, or, and that's the problem, and we don't generate options. And when it gets stuck, it can be things like old patterns or emotional overload, and our brain just gets overheated, and we drop down to that lizard brain that only, it runs in fear and fights if it has to. And we sort of go into that mode, fighting with ourselves, that sort of thing, or go frozen. So we don't make any move to any option. And so none of those things are that great. But one of the things that we can do when we're in that space, if we're in a trauma response, if we're in an old pattern, if we're just caught off guard or overwhelmed, the best thing to do is interrupt your physical being. And what I mean by that is just to do something different. Somebody texted me saying they were going to do something that really was a bad plan. And they didn't feel if they had any other options. And so I said, can you walk around your room backwards? Just walk around the room backwards a few times and let me know how you do it. And the reason is, when we engage our brain in that way, it interrupts that clench or that fevered pitch. Those things that, narrow our field and makes us think that, we've got to do this, whatever the compulsion that has come up is. And so if we can do things like that. And another one that I use a lot, and I just had the absolute joy of teaching this to some people at a treatment center last night. Now I have to get a little assistive device. Okay, now I'm sure you probably all have one. You may have one right in front of you, so feel free to join me. And we've probably talked about this before. And you go like this. And you go like that because it triggers chemicals in your brain to be different. And I was sitting in a group of addicts and they were all kind of, I'm like, okay, do it, do it, do it. And you actually smile. And so if we could smile, but we don't think to smile in that, but something like putting a pen in our mouth is actually that circuit breaker that we need. And so if people put the pen in their mouth, because I don't know about you, but when you're walking around going, you put the pen in your mouth and you stop and like, what the heck's going on here? And that's what we're looking for, that we're absolutely looking to engage this part of our brain to see what's going on. And so those kinds of things are really useful. Physical movement is about the only thing we can do at that time. And it has to be quite novel to make it work, to get our brain sort of jumped out of that. There's many other things we can do. We're going to talk about some more of them later, but just wanted to make that point. When people are frozen or really stuck like that, that's one of the best ways to get it. Now, our brain can go into it for other reasons too, and substances are one of the big ones. And it might be simple like alcohol or marijuana or sugar, or it might be sophisticated like designer drugs or pharmaceutical drugs, but they can all impair our thought processes and narrow our field of thought. And sometimes we don't know. Antidepressant and anxiety drugs often have warnings written right on them. This could cause more of that. And so it can change that perspective. And lots of people think, the only thing I can do is take this drug. And often on the drug, the only thing they want to do is not do anything. And so there's lots of interesting things where they get really hyped up and then they are making poor choices because they don't see the real options in front of them. And one of the other things is, of course, our own biology can just act up in our body without our will. Mine does it all the time. And one of the things I really recommend for that is lay on the floor. Get as low as you can and as flat as you can. Because if I am walking around, I'm in danger of going somewhere doing something that wouldn't work out well. And so laying down on the floor really helps that. But sometimes it's like a mineral or a vitamin excess or deficit that can cause this kind of thing. There's things that when we eat a lot of sugar, like I have in my lifetime, we can get really deficit in some of the vitamins and minerals that are necessities for neural pathways. So my neurons won't talk to each other because they don't have the chemicals and vitamins and minerals that they need for each junction. And so I literally can't get an understanding of the options because I'm not having the firing that I need. And that can be a difficulty that shows up in this narrow thinking, this rigid thinking. Another way that it might show up is that we might have allergies or inflammations in our bodies. And wheat, corn, sugar, maltodextrin are absolutely famous for that. People will come and talk to me about, well, I don't know what's going on, but I'm so irritable. And my partner, husband, child, fill in the blank, does this and blah, 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 and they have to do it this way. And I'm like, let's just talk about what you've ingested in the last little while, because it can take people by surprise and they don't know what's going on. And viruses, bacteria, things like that can show up and cause us the same kind of things. Often when people were in COVID, they would talk about that confusion and not being able to see what options they had to do things about. And there's lots of impact like that, and for lots of different reasons. And so those are the kinds of things that happen. And we notice that with addicts, a lot of times it's obvious because it narrows down to repeating the addictive behavior or using the addictive substance. But for people that are non-addicts, we can find it, we're doing the same thing and we don't like that we're doing it. And then we're going along, we might get mad at the same person for the same thing over and over and over. And so those options have come like this. Because if my dog kept peeing on the floor, I would research other options. But when someone does something annoying to me and I just, sort of ignore it a bit and sort of get used to it, but I'm still bugged by it, I'm not shopping for any options. It's not as obvious as going out and, getting a dog trainer or buying pee pads or, there's nothing as obvious about that in interpersonal relationships. But one of the things that's so important, and I'll say it again several times tonight, I'm sure, is being able to have the idea to resource and get support. So looking for resources and looking for support so that I can open my brain to the other options. And so, but we tend to fall into these crevices where we don't do that. And it can be repetitive things. For a long time, I would so frustrate myself about all of the things that would fall out of the hall closet every time I looked for my scarf or my gloves or whatever. And then one day, I really just found other options. It struck me that I would actually put them in little baskets. Didn't fall out ever again, but I couldn't think that for a long time. And so it can be simple things like that, or really important things like whether to stay in a relationship or not, or whether to, help get some help for a child or go to a different job. So it's really important to notice if we are having trouble generating kind of options. And the other thing that happens a lot is just dysregulation in our bodies, and dysregulation for lots of reasons. It may be that we didn't get enough sleep, or it might be old safety behaviors. It might be trauma things, but anytime that we are not able to generate options, or we think all of them are bad, we should start looking about those other things. Can I regulate my body more? Can I interrupt the brain pattern? Is there something I've ingested? All sorts of things like that. The trouble is, because when we get to that point where we don't think there's any options, we get into lots of difficult behavior. And it may even be that someone has been telling us for a long time that we don't have any other options. It might actually be, somebody trying to say it that way. And it may be their experience and may not be trying to do that to us intentionally. And sometimes they are trying to do it intentionally. And I've seen it in workplaces and I've seen it in homes, and it's not unusual, even with a neighbor. And there's a neighbor that has a different standard of lawn care than I would uphold, that is insisting that it has to be that way. And I'm like, actually, no, we have other options. But whatever it is really fatiguing for us, and we may get into people pleasing or defensiveness, or we may just not know that we're narrowed down in our options. We may not have noticed it. We may have been that way so long that we think that's the way it is. So I think that's a really dangerous kind of situation, because the more we believe that, or the more we fixate on one thing to save us, we become frightened and angry and reckless and isolated and a whole bunch of things like that. And eventually, sometimes we won't try anything at all. And that's a much, much higher number of people have been saying that since the pandemic, because they've been through all that stress, and there was a feeling of no other options so much. And the higher the stress level, the more difficult it is for us to think of options or even move towards them. Talk a little more about that in a moment. Now, I always talk about early intervention, and it is the best prevention for this sort of option oblivion that we can get into. And it might just be something as simple as encouraging ourselves to keep an open mind about our options, to remind ourselves, just a minute, when something comes up and I'm getting all lizard brain, can I just go, wait a minute, I may not know them yet, but there's going to be some other options coming up. And it's useful. It's just useful to practice that. It's sort of like stretching. And that then we can start setting about looking for resources, trying to gather support. We might have to have somebody come in and say to them, you're like, I can't figure out any other solutions to this. and, asking people like that. So, but you can back up and start just with an intention to investigate where you are with this idea of options. Are you somebody that generates a whole bunch of options? Are you somebody who doesn't generate options very well? Do you generate and not follow them through? So it's just a good exploration to do. And find out if you're believing things that are accurate or not about your ability to have options. And it may be you have really good ideas about options in part of your life, and then over here, it's much smaller that you don't think you have any options. And in my work with compulsive eaters, lots of times they find that they feel there's no other option except to eat. And again, I often start suggesting really unusual things, novel things, get your brain. Things like, can you just throw the food in the floor? And they look shocked at me. But it's really interesting because so many people have come back saying, oh, okay, I poured it down the sink, or I poured it on the grass and stomped on it, or I threw it in the garbage, or just to interrupt the pattern of no options. And so it's possible like that. If we have some, say, a difficult situation with someone in our lives, particularly if it's been going on for a long time, and we might have just come to a place of awareness or wellness that we're able to see it and look into maybe changing it. But if we can become over-focused on them and think about their options, not our options. And this is one of the tricky ones too, that we have to come to that place of, okay, no matter what the problem is that I have, who it involves, one of the options is to work with myself, and maybe getting resources, getting support, just seeing why I think I don't have any other options except to try and arrange their options or get them to take options I'd like them to take. So that's one of the ones that can get a little confusing and distracting. Good to pay attention though. But again, the novel interventions. And for some of us trying to help other people find their options, we can be quite surprised when people say, well, why don't you go and relax? And I'm like, really? You think that's a good idea for their situation? And so it's novel to my brain. So of course that works here. I have a spiritual practice that I wanted to share. It came from a friend of mine that I've known for a long time, and it's practiced by practically all the brilliant scientists and entrepreneurs and people that have been successful in interesting ways. And what they do is put whatever the issue is at hand into their mind before they go to sleep. And they simply ask for some other options to further it, to solve it, to investigate. And often wakes up with really different ideas. And those different ideas often lead them down a unique path, because it's not something they could have just sat and put their brain power into like this. It opened up, well, their brain was in a different state. It's actually different brain waves at that time. But people like Einstein and lots of people have done this, and it works really effectively. And I want to try and experiment with this a little bit, but I want you I'm going to give you some suggestions about stimuluses that you might use to see what kind of options you experience. And then if you can generate different options, because there is an idea like the quote in the email this week. I like having options, alternative lives, unlived, but always possible. And in my own life, I've changed careers half a dozen times. And it's always been a surprise to me, but I was in a situation where I needed another option, and I did that sort of thing. So the stimulus might be a good stimulus, or it might be a negative stimulus, but we want to generate options on either side regardless. So we're going to practice here a little bit, and then I'll give you a couple of examples there. But one last note, there's a caveat here that there are some of us that generate too many options, and then we get decision frantic. And so there's a sentence that I encourage people to use that say, and I don't have to choose any of the options. And I can take my time and feel what is best for me. And it's really useful to keep that things calm. So I don't have to choose any, and I can take my time and intuit what is best for me. And then if you suddenly get a whole bunch of brainstorms, you can write them all down, but you can go through them intuitively and be like, what does that feel like? So what I encourage you to do now is relax a little bit. And we're just going to contemplate. Okay? So what I'm going to do is just a stimulus and just have you notice what kind of options of response that come up in you. There'll be some that just come up, and then others that we'll explore a little bit. Okay, just take that deep breath, relax. Get ready to stretch your brain a little bit. You never know, you might find things that are interesting and options you'd like to pursue further. So the first one, just imagine that you've been traveling out of country and you're coming home, you've landed at the airport, but when you go through customs, you don't have your passport. And just notice, what are the options that come up? And the options might be lots of panic and running around, checking in different places, all those kinds of things. Trying to explain it to somebody, getting somebody to go run back up on the plane, seeing if anybody you're traveling with is holding it. So there is this process that we go through when we're looking for options, when we're experiencing responses. And I want you to perceive that none of those work. And just imagine what you might do next. And it might help if you visualize it. Sometimes that helps people generate options. And it might help some of the things we talked about, how to calm your body down. Maybe that's one of the options before you even get to the next one about options about passport and getting back into the country. And just relax your body and use the reminder that there are always other options. It may be beyond what you can imagine at this moment, but this is the process of you'll get a first wave, and then you may or may not be successful with that, and you can expand your mind again. And do some of that resourcing and getting support. But time always moves on. So we have always got another option. And I'll get you to have a rest there for a moment. Clear your mind. We'll go into a different scenario. Okay, now you're at home and the doorbell rings. And someone has brought you flowers. And so you accept them and the delivery person goes on their way, but there's no card to indicate who they're from. And we all start looking for options at this point. We might be looking at the option of, how do I find out who this is? I might want to run them outside and say, hey, haven't you made a mistake? Do you know? You might just be sitting there delighted with the flowers. Just decide that the option is to keep them and enjoy them. And I want to see if you have options to take your enjoyment of the flowers a little deeper. What you might do. And some of it you might do instinctively. You might lean over and smell them. You might even reach out and touch them. You might find a place where you will see them frequently and well. We are not as well versed at options for enjoying, expanding our awareness of enjoyment as we are at trying to generate options to get what we want or avoid things we don't. So I'd encourage you to practice this idea of creating options as just a nice preventative health stretch for your brain. For both those moments when we're anxious and confused, and those moments that present positive experiences. How can I enter more deeply into the positive experience too? Okay. I'll leave the people that are live with me to contemplate as they will. And we're just going to close for tonight for those that are watching this later. And feel free to send any questions, comments, donations to scientistsage@gmail.com. We're so thankful that you've been here with us. I hope you enjoyed this and found it useful. And again, if you have any questions or comments, please send them on. We'd love to hear them. Thank you.